and Febreze.
Well, hi there, folks. My name is Dara Starr Tucker, and this is The Breakdown. Thank you so much for joining me here on KJLH. I'm glad to have you. I want to let you know where you can find me online. I am on Instagram at Dara Tucker B. You can find me on TikTok and all other platforms at Dara Starr Tucker. That's Dara with one R and Starr with two. I recently saw a video by a TikTok and Instagram mutual of mine named Gerard LeConte, and you may recognize his name because he's been on the show before, where he sort of highlighted an issue that I have been greatly concerned with for a long time, and that's the toxic masculinity that has crept into specifically the alt-right conservative movement these days. And I have a lot of observations about this. I have a lot of scattered thoughts about it, but Gerard just has this way of bringing it all into focus. And he did a very, very good and very informative video very recently on his TikTok and on his Instagram about this subject. And I kind of want to get in and do a deep dive with Gerard about this. So first, I want to introduce you to Gerard LeConte. Thank you so much for being here with us on The Breakdown. Thank you for being here. I'm so glad to have you back on the show.
The feeling is mutual. Thanks for having me back. It's wild to think that it was just a few weeks ago we were talking about whether or not Biden would stay in the race, and now it feels like an entirely new election. But, and I kind
of want to get into that with you. I want to ask you very quickly before we play your piece for the folks. I want to play that for them before we get into this discussion that we're here to have. First of all, Gerard, can you tell the audience where to find you?
Yep. Online. You can find me at gerard.leconte. That's GERARD.LECONTE on TikTok, or Gerard LeConte Politics on Instagram and Threads.
Okay, wonderful. Please find Gerard and follow him. I kind of want to, though, get into some of what you have been talking about online recently about some troubling things that you're seeing happening within the so-called alt-right. I feel like this is a movement that has been growing. We're seeing numbers around how many young men are really being radicalized by the so-called alt-right these days. It's a concerning thing. It's not something that I know, really what to do with. I just know what it is that we're observing. I know that a lot of young men are responding to the shifting dynamics in the culture by being, pushed further right, allowing themselves to be pushed further right. And so let me play the piece that you did, Gerard, on the alt-right movement and its influence particularly on young men. And we'll be back to talk about it.
The goal of right-wing media has been to make their audience antisocial for a while now, and it's pretty easy to see how they do it. They inundate them with increasingly extremist and deranged ideas, and then they encourage them to push those ideas onto the people in their lives, knowing that it's bound to alienate them. We saw an excellent example of this recently in an interview on Newsmax with Roseanne Barr.
And you've been talking to some of your Democrat friends. What was their reaction? Were they surprised that Biden pulled out of the race?
I still have Democrat kids. Oh, God help me. And my mom, too, is still a Democrat.
We've got to convert them, Roseanne.
I tried like hell. And my brother, my gay sister, they're all, I tried like hell. Now they don't even talk to me. I try to text them, and they don't even take my text. Whatever.
Roseanne, we still love you here at Newsmax. So we're going to...
Becoming alienated from your friends and family is a tragedy, and it's one that many of us have seen in our own lives when a friend or family member falls down the right-wing disinformation hole. But it isn't an accident. Right-wing media outlets prime their audience to insulate themselves when they receive pushback from their families and communities around these ideas. They'll say stuff like, people are going to call you racist or sexist or generally treat you like a bad person because you believe these things. But you just know the truth and they can't handle it. But don't worry, we know you're right and we accept you. This is on purpose. They want people to rely on them not only for news and information, but also for identity and belonging. It makes it that much easier for them to radicalize them. This is nothing new. It's been a go-to strategy for cults, extremist groups, and multi-level marketing schemes forever. But bringing these tactics into news and news entertainment really was Roger Ailes' great innovation. and it's how he revolutionized right-wing media. Trump, like demagogues often do, brought these tactics into political campaigning, and it's continuing to be an evolving aspect to his campaign strategy this election cycle. In fact, that evolution helped motivate the decision to choose J.D. Vance as his running mate in a way that I think the political press has completely missed. Consider this.
But look, what I was basically saying is that we're effectively run in this country via the Democrats, via our corporate oligarchs, by a bunch of childless cat ladies who are miserable at their own lives and the choices that they've made, and so they want to make the rest of the country miserable too. And it's just a basic fact. You look at Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg, AOC, the entire future of the Democrats is controlled by people without children.
This clip has gotten a lot of play, particularly online, but mostly within the context of how misogynistic and sexist it is. And it is definitely both of those things. But the Trump campaign appears to have made a strategic decision to be a red pill campaign. And why is that? It's because young men are ripe for radicalization right now. What explains the rise of red pill and incel culture? Why are denigrations of single women, attacks on IVF, and appeals to traditional patriarchal nostalgia so effective right now? It's because the more pressure there is on women to be in a relationship with men, the less effort men have to put into being attractive to women. And that appeals to the subset of men who are extremely resentful about the cultural shift towards women having more agency about whether they're in a relationship and who they're in a relationship with, because they are lonely. And agency is an easy thing to blame for that loneliness. Now, I'm not sitting here saying that any of us should have a particular sympathy for men who have gone down an extremist, misogynist rabbit hole, but loneliness can destroy a culture. The United States is and has been for a few decades now experiencing a cultural crisis among men and around masculinity that is fundamentally rooted in loneliness. For centuries, men have found belonging in their status, and that status is changing, and many of us don't know how to handle it, and instead of handling it in a healthy and productive way, many of us have isolated and alienated ourselves from our friends, families, and communities, instead supplementing with superficial community built around rage about our loneliness. Instead of offering solutions to this serious problem, the Trump campaign sees an opportunity to capitalize on that loneliness. They see an opportunity for expedient radicalization. They see an opportunity to turn out a historically low propensity voting demographic and use it to gain more power. The left of center coalition should continue to search for more diverse and accessible ways to offer men, and especially young men, an off-ramp from this radicalization, an entry point back into community, a reprieve from loneliness that doesn't feel like these men are sacrificing their masculinity, because our current way of going about it is leaving a gap. It's a gap that we've seen grifters and fraudsters like Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson fill for years, but now it's a gap that Donald Trump is exploiting and pursuing more aggressively, and it's dangerous.
All right, so that is the piece that Gerard LeConte did on the influence of the right on young men, the radicalization of a lot of young men within the Republican Party specifically. Gerard, can you tell us more about maybe why you chose to do that piece right now? What are you observing in the culture that even put your attention and your focus on this phenomenon?
Yeah, and before we get too deep into it, I do want to acknowledge really quickly that we're about to cover some sensitive topics, and it's impossible to discuss this situation without using some pretty gendered language and without touching on one part of an intersectional experience that we all meet in our own ways. So I want to just kind of recognize and put out there that we're speaking from our personal experiences, and they're not always going to align with the audiences. And we're looking to have a thoughtful and mindful and honest conversation about this. We're not looking to offend anybody or leave anybody out. But what the primary reason why I felt it was an important time to talk about it is because, you know, you mentioned Richard Spencer earlier. He is a self-described white nationalist, but he's also a self-described chauvinist. And those two things often interplay. We often see chauvinism and misogyny alongside white supremacy and racism, but they are not necessarily the same thing, and they are not always necessarily targeting the same people. And what the selection of J.D. Vance as Donald Trump's running mate showed me was that the Trump campaign was leaning into the red pill culture, the manosphere, if you will, alt-right, in a way that we hadn't seen a major campaign do in the past. And it seemed to me that he was attempting to turn out what is a historically low propensity voter, which is young men, by appealing specifically to this red pill culture and by tapping into a disaffection and loneliness that we are seeing spread rapidly throughout young men. And I think that this is actually a really good opportunity now that we have somebody on the main stage like J.D. Vance to look at the effort to radicalize men and boys as a problem in of itself and not necessarily just as a symptom of, for lack of a better term, toxic masculinity. I think when you compare this to, say, a lot of the work coming out right now by Jonathan Haidt, for example, on social media and the effects of how much time we're spending in digital spaces. When we look at the effects of Instagram, for example, on young women and girls, we look at it as something that is happening to them, and we treat it as a problem that is happening to them. But when we look at boys who are interacting with content from, say, someone like Andrew Tate, we look at it as a toxic masculinity problem. We look at it as a problem with the boys and not necessarily a problem that's happening to the boys. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a very good opportunity now that somebody like J.D. Vance and his extreme ideas about the world is on the stage. We have an opportunity to really look at it as a problem that's happening to young boys and not necessarily looking at it as a problem of masculinity itself.
Mm-hmm. That's a really important distinction. And one of the reasons that I feel that even though I observe things like this, it is not necessarily, I'm not necessarily the person who should be addressing this right now, because I feel like that's an insight when you say we look at an issue that's happening with young women as something that's happening to them versus how we look at something that is happening to young men as a problem with young men versus something that is being placed upon them by the culture. I would not necessarily put my head around this issue in that way, which is why it is so important, I think, for other men and young men, older men to be speaking out about this right now, and why we maybe need to be letting you all kind of lead this conversation right now. So I'm so glad that you're focused on it, and a lot of other men right now are focused on it. So what are some of the ways that you're seeing this expressed in the culture, I guess? I'll go back to my initial question. And what is it that even prompted you to want to make that video in the first place?
So to be clear, misogyny in right-wing politics is nothing new. And in a lot of ways, J.D. Vance is not the first running mate chosen in an effort to appeal to misogyny. In a lot of ways, Mike Pence was also chosen for similar appeals. Mm-hmm. Let's not forget that Mike Pence famously refuses to have one-on-one dinners with women. And that is a function of misogyny, right? Mm-hmm. You should be just as comfortable having dinner with a woman as you would with a man. Mm-hmm. And fear around that, fear around women is misogyny in of itself.
Interesting.
What we're seeing in this situation, though, is not necessarily an appeal to traditional ideas of gender relationships from the lens of maybe a Puritan view, like Mike Pence shows, but much more from a chauvinistic view. This idea that women are in society for a utility, not necessarily as humans in of themselves. They're here to build families, and we need them insofar as they are used to build families. And to the extent that society is not using them in that way, society is making a mistake, right? That is J.D. Vance's entire premise when he's talking about childless cat ladies ruining the country. He's basically saying, in slightly more creative language, that we wouldn't be having so many problems if women were just busy making babies instead of trying to run the country. And
I love how his clarification of that with, I don't remember if it was Laura Ingraham or Megyn, I think it was Megyn Kelly. His clarification of that was, people are so focused on the sarcasm of it when they don't understand the point behind it. And the point behind it was as awful, if not more awful, than the sarcasm itself. The overall point that he was making was just as bad.
And there was another interview where he responded to it, and he said, people are are reading into that far too much. Anybody who knows me knows I don't have any problem with cats. And right. Why I think that is important is because he's trolling.
Yes.
He knows what he's doing. Yes. He knows who he's appealing to. And this is not an accident. This is not a matter of somebody that just has a different view of the world being misunderstood by PC culture or whatever. He's appealing to a specific chauvinistic and misogynistic idea of how social hierarchy should work. And the reason why, in my opinion, we are seeing it have so much traction in the last few years is it's a result of the loneliness epidemic that young men are experiencing. I saw a statistic recently that showed that about 1 in 5, somewhere between 1 in 5 and 1 in 4 men have zero friends that they feel like they could confide in about their emotions. That's a 5-fold increase from when the same question was studied in the 90s. And it's a notable increase over over young girls. I want to be clear that in so many ways, boys and men are doing so much better than they ever have. The fathers of my generation are so much different than our fathers, and the sons that we're raising are going to be so much different than we were raised.
Yes.
But it doesn't take that much to have a radicalized movement. And what we're seeing right now is a very extreme subculture that a lot of us, especially millennials, grew up with and saw on the fringes spill over into mainstream. And I think if we, frankly, I think if it wasn't men at the center of it, we would be much more concerned about it as a social justice issue than we are. Because in a lot of ways, these are young men who don't really understand their way in the world, have not built the tools to connect authentically and genuinely with other people around them, have a very real and genuine loneliness as a result of that. And the folks like Andrew Tate, like Jordan Peterson, like J.D. Vance are looking to capitalize on that loneliness.
What I've noticed, particularly with J.D. Vance, and he is such a fascinating character to me. His trajectory has been very interesting. It's been very unusual. And there's been a lot made of the fact that he did not hold the views that he holds now. He was a never Trumper. He hated Donald Trump. He never really seemed to have any interest in being drawn into that circle. But then, like a lot of Republicans before him, the Lindsey Grahams and Ted Cruz's, he's been drawn into Trump's orbit. And so I feel like a lot of the shift, maybe, and I don't know how much of what he preaches is sincere. I don't know how much of it he believes, but a lot of it seemed to happen when he himself became a father. And so when I hear someone talk in this way, the way that J.D. Vance does about having an investment in America's future, these people without children, and we don't, they're not connected in the way we are. Can you speak to that whole issue from the point of view of being a new dad?
Well, because he's actively trying to marginalize you in that process. And specifically, in his language, he's trying to marginalize women who have decided not to have children. First and foremost, when it comes to becoming a father, I don't think we should take his claims that his views changing were because he was a father. Sincerely, I don't think we should. Primarily because I think that the views he's expressing now were represented in the views he expressed early in his life. I think they're represented in Hillbilly Elegy. I'll talk about how in a minute. Me personally, I grew up in a time where, as a young boy, I was spending a lot of time in digital spaces as they were being invented. the precursors to what we see young boys spending a lot of their time on today. And I saw the pathway to this. I heard how boys talked in online gaming. I learned how boys talked to men in online gaming. And a lot of times it was centered around violence against women. And that is what kind of spurs my concern in seeing that fringe behavior spill out into the mainstream, because I know how dangerous it can be. That being said, I also was raised, first of all, predominantly by women. And I was also, I also came up in an environment where many of my close friends were girls and women. So I had defenses built in against misogynistic messaging, if for no other reason than because I knew the way I was hearing women and girls being described did not describe my friends. So it was easy for me to identify it as frankly ridiculous and distorted, right? If you don't have those types of friendships and relationships, it is a lot easier to project what you're hearing from the Andrew Tates of the world onto the women and girls in your lives, because you have never really had access to the inner lives of women and girls. A lot of us were raised by men who did not treat our mothers great, if we had men in our lives at all, right? So there is a void that can be filled by a person like Andrew Tate, who maybe comes across as mainly entertaining at the beginning, but then quickly becomes more insidious than that.
What do you think the hope is that we are able to sort of right the ship a bit? What are some opportunities that we have to impact this phenomenon for the better in the here and now?
So I'll start with what we can do in our own interpersonal relationships. And I'm going to speak specifically to men when I say this. Go to therapy and talk to your friends about therapy. Make yourself a space where these conversations can be had, and do what you can to destigmatize mental health in the relationships you have with other men. We need coaches in a lot of this stuff. And there are professionals out here who can help us learn more about ourselves and learn more about how to access our feelings, right? I know that that's easier said than done. Access to healthcare is a problem, and it's something from a policy standpoint that we could improve on to help aid in this situation. But if you do have access, take advantage of that access and leverage it. Men can also get into their communities a little bit more. I think when it comes to volunteering at the local school, I was an intern in a low-income elementary school when I was in college. And when I became an intern, I also became the third man on campus. And that's a problem. That's a problem. We need more adult men that children can see just being normal contributors to society. Be a volunteer. Just be a volunteer. Volunteer work is too often seen as women's work in this country, in our society.
Wonderful. Well, I really appreciate you taking time to talk through a lot of these issues with us, Gerard. These are not easy subjects to tackle, but I think that you do such a good job of helping us to get our heads around it. And it's so important. And I don't think it's being talked about enough. And when it isn't necessarily talked about with the compassion that you bring to the subject. So I appreciate your point of view, and I appreciate the video that you made about it. And it's so important. I'm so glad it caught on online and that it kind of took off and gained virality. And so I hope it helps a lot of folks, and I think it will. So thank you for being on. Once again, Gerard, please give the folks your contact information and let them know how they can find you online.
Gerard.LeConte. That's GERARD. LECONTE, Gerard.LeConte on TikTok, and Gerard LeConte Politics on Instagram and Threads. As always, the feeling is mutual. Dara, thank you so much for having me on. I can't wait till next time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Well, thank you all for joining us here on The Breakdown on KJLH. You can find me online at You can find me on the KJLH Instagram page at KJLH Radio on Instagram. You can also find me on my personal page on Instagram at Dara Tucker B. Everywhere else at Dara Starr Tucker. That's Dara with one R and Starr with two. Thank you so much for joining me here on The Breakdown. I will see you the same time, same place next week. We're tackling the issues that are very difficult, but we are tackling them one issue at a time. We can do this, folks. We can push this boulder up the hill, and we can push it over the hill. I want us to keep our positivity about us. Make sure that you go to the link in my bio on my social media and check your voter registration. Make sure that that is in order. You can go to vote.org/Dara to check your voter registration. There are people that are being purged from voter rolls all the time. So please do that if you are able. Make sure that that is in order long before the election comes around. So thank you very much for joining me. Look forward to seeing you all next week. And until then, let's learn to shout.